We're privileged to have two speakers, both from the Art Department at Stern College for Women, Professor Marnin Young, who will talk about his book, Realism in the Age of Impressionism, Painting and the Politics of Time. We have copies of the book if you'd like to purchase it, I believe at a discount, is that correct? And Professor Young, I'm sure, will be happy to sign it, thereby increasing its value. And that following Professor Young will be Professor Mary Creede, who, and I think this is a particularly creative pairing. I had nothing to do with it. The credit goes to Eleanor Grumet, Public Services Librarian. The biographies come directly from the faculty, Yeshiva University faculty profile website. So Marnin Young is the author of, as I just said, Realism in the Age of Impressionism. The book received the Millard Mice Publication Fund Grant from the College Art Association and an honorable mention for the Robert Motherwell Book Award from the Daedalus Foundation. Dr. Young has published numerous articles and reviews on 19th century French painting in the Art Bulletin, Art History, CAA.Reviews, Critical Inquiry, H. France Review, 19th Century Art Worldwide, 19th Century Studies, and the RIHA Journal. He's also a contributing editor at the online peer-reviewed journal, nonsite.org. For his teaching at Stern College for Women, he's been selected as the Lillian F. and William L. Silber Professor of the Year in 2011, and the General Studies Professor of the Year by the senior classes of 2011, 2012, and 2015. He also received the Dean Karen Baker Faculty Award in 2014. He's currently researching a book on space in and around post-impressionist painting. Please help me welcome Marnin Young.
Today I'm talking about my first book. I'm currently working on a second book, so this is a little bit old for me. And I thought the best way to proceed was just to go through a series of pictures that I've talked about in this book and to give you a sense of the broad argument and my general concerns in this book. And then we can, maybe in dialogue, talk about how this fits in with work I'm currently undertaking. So I want to start with this painting, which some of you might recognize. I know that the art historians in the room will recognize this. This is a painting in the permanent collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art here in New York. It's a painting produced by the French painter Jules Bastien-Lepage in 1879, and it was first shown publicly at the Paris Salon of 1880. It depicts the peasant girl who would go on to be Saint Joan of Arc, and we see her overcome, entranced, absorbed by the voices she hears in her head, calling her to glory. This is a very well-known story, and especially well-known to French people in the 19th century. And although she does not see them, these voices come from three saints hovering half-transparent behind her on the left side of the picture. You can just barely make this out, and it's great to go to the Met and watch people's reaction to the painting. It's actually a very popular painting at the Met. You always see tourists sort of like trying to figure out what's going on, and you can just barely make out these saints in the background. So it attracts a lot of attention at the Met, and I was especially interested to find that in the recent novel by the Brooklyn-based author Ben Lerner, 1004 is the title of the book. There's a sort of brilliant description, analysis of this painting in the guise of a kind of narration of the protagonist, roughly speaking Ben Lerner. It's a sort of fictional variation of the author. He and his friend Alex make a trip to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and they are entranced by this picture. And here's what the narrator of this novel, 1004, has to say about this painting. Quote, "The museum placard says that Bastien-Lepage was attacked for his failure to reconcile the ethereality of the angels with the realism of the future saint's body. But that failure is what makes it one of my favorite paintings. It's as if the tension between the metaphysical and the physical worlds, between the two orders of temporality, produces a glitch in the pictorial matrix. The background swallows her fingers." He continues, "Standing there that afternoon with Alex, I was reminded of the photograph Marty carries in Back to the Future. Crucial movie of my youth. As Marty's time traveling disrupts the prehistory of his family, he and his siblings begin to fade from the snapshot. Only here it's a presence, not an absence, that eats away at her hand. She's being pulled into the future." And these are the two images that Lerner reproduces in this novel. And even though he's talking about the photograph that Marty has in Back to the Future, he shows a still from the movie where his hand begins to fade. So not only the image in the photograph, but his own body begins to fade as the future is changed in the movie. I don't know if you know that movie. I'm old enough to have seen it in the movie theater. But it's the hands that he draws the connection to, so that in both of these pictures, the hands begin to fade in some peculiar way. So as an art historian, I was really delighted to read Lerner's brief analysis of the two orders of temporality in Bastien-Lepage's painting. It is a brilliant picture, and it has received very little attention within the discipline. Very little art historical writing has ever been produced about this painting. And I think there's still a lot of room for an extended analysis of the painting. But I was really delighted because Lerner touches on the surface of a much deeper artistic phenomenon, one that had interested me for quite a long time. In fact, Bastien-Lepage's Joan of Arc is only one of a very large number of paintings in the 1870s and 1880s that rest on or play with two different orders of temporality. Rather than past and future, ethereal and real, I would argue that this double temporality can be better described as durational and instantaneous. That is, on the one hand, we have a sense that Joan is fixed by her revelation, standing unmoving, even as the light-filled surroundings, the tipped-over stool in the background, and the floating angels suggest a passing moment. So durational and instantaneous, or to put it slightly differently, realist and impressionist. The relation of realism and impressionism, duration and instant, is the subject of my book, Realism in the Age of Impressionism, Painting and the Politics of Time. And Bastien-Lepage is, not surprisingly, one of its central characters. More important than Joan of Arc, however, in my view, is this painting, his breakthrough work shown at the Salon of 1878 and now in the permanent collection of the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. And this is the subject or the topic of chapter 1 of the book. So the picture depicts a peasant woman and her male companion resting at midday from the grueling labor of harvesting hay. It was produced at an important juncture in the history of French agriculture. Things are changing. Traditionally, harvesting was done largely by seasonal workers armed with sickles and scythes. And we actually have a slight indication that those traditional tools are still in the background here. But by the 1870s, this mode of harvesting had already been displaced in many quarters by more mechanical means, horse-drawn harvesters, for instance, and into the 20th century, this is completely transformed. The shift was slow and steady, but it sits at the origins of our current dominance of agribusiness. So today, everything's mechanized and industrialized and so forth, and that's beginning in the 19th century, precisely at this time. So along with the mechanization of agriculture in the 19th century came a new approach to labor. Itinerant laborers had previously been hired by local farms to do the harvesting in the summer months and were usually paid a portion of the crop or a set sum for the whole harvest. And this was how it had been done since the Middle Ages. But by the time Bastien-Lepage painted this scene of haymaking, so-called day laborers were paid wages for the time they worked, just like a factory worker. So a woman such as this was probably paid 2 francs a day, her male companion, 3, #Me Too. In large part, this pay was designed to offset the lure of higher wages in factory work and in railroad or building construction in the city. So there's a real competition for labor in France and elsewhere in the 19th century. And so there's actually a kind of inflation of wages going on and a kind of a system of wages that's being introduced throughout the agriculture and industrial sectors in the 19th century. So because this was the peculiar economic reality of rural life in the late 1870s, and it was new, a painting of peasant labor and rest was a charged and controversial one. As the son of a small landowner in rural France, Bastien-Lepage knew this very well, and his painting clearly sought to find an artistic representation that matched the complexity of its subject matter. So scenes of peasant labor and even peasant rest were fairly common in the decades before this. It's actually just fills the rooms of the salons in Paris at this time. But a rather notable and unusual aspect of this painting is its provocative posing of the female peasant, as if in a trance, just sort of sitting there with her eyes open. Hostile critics in 1878, and there were a lot, said she was animalistic, like a cow chewing cud, unthinking. But those who admired the painting found her highly compelling precisely because she was so strikingly held in place, absorbed in her own reverie, allowing the beholder to examine the details of her face and close the dirt under her fingernails. And you can see this today at the Musée d'Orsay. She's actually got the dirt under her fingernails. Very, very finely detailed description of the body. So this trance-like pose, what the art historian Michael Creede would call absorption, is not only what gives the painting a realistic effect, and it does give it a realistic effect, but it also harmonizes the closely observed subject with a highly finished rendering of the subject. So just as Bastien-Lepage seems to have taken his time to paint the peasant subject remains unmoving in front of him, and in turn in front of us. So we can look closely at her, and we can get involved in looking at the details and remain transfixed by her. I think that's partly one of the things that we experience at the Met when we look at Joan of Arc. There's a sense of like we can look at her and she just stays there frozen in that same sort of trance-like absorption, and she's not aware of us looking at her, and we can just continue looking at her. So here the slowness of the drowsy midday rest is perfectly matched by the slowness of the painter's technique, that very finely realist rendering. And all this is consistent with French realism as it had been practiced in the middle of the century. Just to give you a sense of what I mean, here are two canonical examples of mid-century realism. Gustave Courbet on the left and Jean-François Millet on the right. These artists were extremely well known in France and elsewhere, and as all the critics pointed out at the time, Bastien-Lepage clearly references them both. And I argue he specifically makes use of their slowed down pictorial temporality. And what I mean here is that in Courbet's case, for example, we see three men having had a heavy midday French meal, had a nice bottle of wine, and one of their friends is playing a violin, and they're just sort of dozing there, listening to this. Nothing's changing, unmoving. They're completely entranced by what's happening, and the artist is able to render this with fine detail as if he, too, was there painting this scene. On the right, we see a slightly different scenario. Millet's Angelus, one of the best-known paintings of the 19th century, depicts a moment of rest, or rather pause, not quite rest, but a pause in the labor of two peasants, a man and a woman, presumably husband and wife, who are harvesting potatoes. So it's the potato harvest in the fall, probably October, and they're harvesting the potatoes, but they're stopping to pray. And the Angelus for any French Catholic then and now would have been very clear. The Angelus is the afternoon call to prayer. The bells ring at a certain time. You stop and you say a little Hail Mary. Angelus is actually a sort of fragment of the prayer in Latin. And that's what they're doing. They're pausing and they're praying. This is a traditional pause in the afternoon. And it came typically, traditionally, at sundown. So the sun's going down and they're pausing to pray. But what's really interesting is that over the course of the 19th century, all these clocks, all these bells that rang to tell you when to pray, and you can see the bell tower in the background ringing the bell for the Angelus. Increasingly, they were coordinated with the clocks, and that's why I'm doing this sort of Freudian slip. The clock and the bells were the same thing by the 1850s. So all the bells in France were coordinated with the clocks. So the bells rang not at sun up and sun down, but rather at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. all year round. And this was a major transformation in the way that time was structured in the 19th century. So one of my big claims in the book is that there's this cultural transformation of temporality, that the way we experience time, all our clocks are coordinated and synchronized. That's a phenomenon of the 1870s and the 1880s. Looking at an artist who's engaged with this tradition of painting a kind of slowness or a duration or a kind of pausing of time in art, but also someone who is quite aware of this cultural transformation. So like the slightly later Joan of Arc painting, haymaking suggests a second order of temporality, what Lerner calls the two orders of temporality. So once we shift our view away from the central peasant woman who's sort of frozen there, held in place, we note that the background, the surrounding landscape, is painted in a much sketchier, much loosely rendered technique. It's really quite striking. Her fingernails have this amazing detail. Then you look at the background, it's all just brush strokes there. So we might even note that the foreground is slightly shaded, whereas the background is in bright sunlight. And so, in other words, the peasant woman is painted in a realist style, and the landscape is painted in a more impressionist style, one that evokes a speed of perception and a passing moment rather than the slowly observed and slowly rendered one. So the two orders of temporality in haymaking are stylistic in nature. But importantly, they also correspond to the shifting economic orders of rural labor. The older system of labor matched peasant pay to the product of their labor, how much they produced. while the new system paid them for their time. And it was a measured time, the clock time. You worked 8 hours, you get paid this amount of money. So to depict a modern peasant in a realist style against an impressionist backdrop, to stage durational time against the instant, is to place traditional rural labor against the new economic order. And critics intuited this. They didn't exactly say this. This is my job as a historical interpretation. But there are all sorts of clues that the critics were aware of this. For example, one of them said, soon enough the bells will call her back to work. And the noonday bell was meant to sort of call you back to work, or to tell you when to take a lunch break. So our whole pattern of working 8 hours, getting to work at 9 to 5, with an hour for lunch, this is all being, coming into being in the 19th century. So in its use of realist techniques in and against Impressionism, Bastien-Lepage's painting is a fine example of what I call late realism. For the generation of artists born around 1848, realism still seemed a basic starting point for their art. And as I argue, it was specifically the temporal elements of realism, the slowness and durational time of Courbet and Millet, that seemed to attract them. There are actually a very large number of painters interested in a persistence or revival of realism in the 1870s, but the best of them are aware of the emerging dominance of Impressionism. I think the work of Gustave Caillebotte is a good case in point, and he's the subject of Chapter 2. So Caillebotte rose to prominence in the mid-1870s as, quote, the Impressionist who was not an Impressionist. This is how one critic put it at the time. And what he meant was that Caillebotte was a member of the Impressionist group, but he painted in a style more like Gustave Courbet. But by the late 1870s, his style began to change. This is part of the story of Gustave Caillebotte, that he's well known for these sorts of paintings, on the left in the Musée d'Orsay, on the right in the Art Institute of Chicago. But he didn't paint this way for very long. He actually began to change his style, and this is really the topic of Chapter 2 in my book. In 1879, Caillebotte exhibited these 3 paintings at the Impressionists Exhibition. They emblematized the very large number of works that he showed that year. He totally dominated this year's exhibition in 1879, showed something like 50 different paintings, all in a brand new style, which was much closer to Impressionism. These works were shown as a kind of group work, a single work. It's now called decorative triptych. This is not what he called it at the time. They were titled Fishing, Bathers, and Peressoir, which refers to this peculiar kind of boat. It's kind of like a kayak. It was the craze of the day, these kind of boats. So there are 3 different activities, all of which were more in line with Impressionist subjects than realist subjects. So all the critics noted that these works marked an attempt to bring Caillebotte's painting more closely in line with Impressionist techniques of paint handling and subject matter. Light glistening off water, for instance, was a new concern in his work, and much more like that of, say, Claude Monet. And this implied an attempt to convey a passing moment, instant, a project that had been tied to Impressionism from early on. At the first Impressionist exhibit of 1874, for example, critics pointed to the, quote, fugitive, instantaneous movement in his Boulevard de Capucines. What is striking, then, is the difference between Caillebotte's more famous early work and the pictures he began producing in around 1878. The 1875 Floor Scrapers implies a kind of continuous, repetitive labor, back and forth over several hours, dulled and dulling. This is the subject of realist labor, and Courbet produced many paintings that were like this. The Peressoir, on the other hand, suggests a kind of repetitive action, the oars cutting through the water, but the rippling water itself and the reflection of light on a sunny afternoon imply a transient and ever-changing perceptual world that the Floor Scrapers does not, or not quite so intensively. The perspectivalism and relatively detailed rendering of the earlier picture also adds to the sense of continuity rather than ephemerality. We get a sense that the workers are going to do the same thing for hours and hours and hours, whereas these guys are going to change and move along and get to somewhere new. So, indeed, one of the central artistic problems this generation faced was the tension between a modern subject and its rendering. How do you depict the modern world? This is the great question for the late 19th century. To show the hustle and bustle of modern life, people moving through the streets, things changing, technological changes. How can you render this using the academic techniques that the artists had learned in art school? You were still taught to do finely rendered pictures in perspective based on the human body and models in the studio. These things didn't quite allow you to capture the sensation of transience and speed that were becoming the hallmarks of modernity. Impressionism did a much better job of conveying how things were changing and moving and transforming in modern life. So shifting cultural perceptions of time had become a notable part of European life around 1880. Between the publication of Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days in 1873 to the standardization of world time at the Greenwich Prime Meridian Conference in 1884, certain temporal structures emerged that we now take as a given. Clocks were universally synchronized with designated time zones, and this enabled work time, like harvesting, to become increasingly disciplined. So you could ask the workers all to show up at the same time because the time was the same for everybody. And that's new. It used to be, you'd sort of say, what time is noon? Noon is when the sun's at the highest in the sky. We don't have that experience. If we do have that experience, it's just a coincidence, right? It doesn't really correspond with our notion of noon now. Noon is when our clocks say that it's noon. That's a phenomenon of the early 1880s. So in reaction, the labor movement, unions and so forth, coalesced around work time reforms, including the demand for an 8-hour day and time off on the weekend, which they did not have anywhere in 1880. In the late 1870s, strikes erupted in the northern coalfields of France and Belgium, demanding precisely such regulation of the time of work. The French government actually entered into extended debates about such reforms. There was a law that was proposed in 1880 to limit time or to regulate the time of work in coal mines, but they did not pass, and the law did not become it did not pass until several decades later. It's really only after the First World War that we see a kind of broad embrace of the regulation of work time. At the Salon of 1880, Alfred Rohl exhibited a very large and very widely discussed painting depicting precisely such a strike. And everybody recognized this is what's going on. You read the newspaper and look at this painting. It's the same thing. The canvas is no longer extant, and I only have this black and white photograph to show you, but reproductions of the work indicate why the picture drew such attention at the time. It depicts a dramatic conflict between miners and the authorities. One of the strikers is being arrested at center right. He's actually obscured by this horse, which seems to be a kind of quote of Velasquez here. But this the man's being arrested. He's being shackled by these two policemen, these gendarmes, while various other strikers are upset. There are people agitating. There's a flag flying in the background. And I talk at length about the color of that flag. It's actually a really crucial detail, which I unpack here. I'm not going to say anything about it now, but if you want to know more, I'll talk about that later. So the drama, I argue, is suspended. The man is being arrested. Note the man about you, but not actually throwing a stone in the foreground or a piece of coal. He's pulling his arm back, but his wife's restraining him. He's frozen there in this almost like a pose, like he's posing as if he's about to throw a stone. Everything is arrested, so to speak, in this painting. And that corresponds to the logic of any strike. A strike is the suspension or arresting of the time of labor. Teachers in West Virginia don't work. That's the point of a strike. So what Rohl achieves here is a fit between the temporal characteristics of a later realist history painting and the pressing contemporary crisis of labor, freezing the time of painting just as workers are freezing the time of labor. In the case of Jean-François Raffaelli, those subjects were found among the poor, dejected occupants of the Parisian banlieue, this industrializing and largely inchoate territory around the metropolitan center of Paris, what we call the suburbs, but in France, the suburbs imply kind of downtrodden working class areas as opposed to our notion of suburbs as kind of a lower middle class escape from the city. So rag pickers constitute a key motif in Raffaelli's art, not least, I think, because they function within an older temporal structure of work, basically without any discipline whatsoever. And the idea of rag pickers is basically like, well, we sort of have similar things in New York. We see people going around collecting cans. You see this phenomenon, big plastic bags full of recyclable cans. We're too lazy or too rich to actually take our cans back to the grocery store to get the 5 cents on each can. But somebody makes a very low wage by going around and doing this. And that's the same idea of the lowest orders of the economic system in France in the 19th century, that you could find sort of rags and cast-off cats and so forth that could be recycled in some way. And there was a whole economy of recycling in the 19th century. And actually a lot of the book trade was built out of this. Rags were used for book trade, for you librarians. And, in the 19th century there's this transformation into wood pulp, which is a horrible archival nightmare for librarians, but it's rags that really survive, and that's what a lot of the use of the rags were. So here in his most famous painting, Raffaele shows two downtrodden alcoholics wasting away their day in front of a bar near Agnières, the suburban town where the artist lived. And this painting was shown at the 6th Impressionist Exhibition in 1881, and it attracted a lot of attention. And to be honest, we're not actually sure where this is. It might be Agnières, it might be somewhere else. But you can just make out a railroad line in the upper left-hand corner. That's a so-called palisade and a signal for a rail line. And these rail lines cut through the suburbs. And I argue that the railroad is, of course, the emblem of speed in the 19th century. It's the fastest way that human beings have ever traveled in the history of the world in the 19th century. So it's the emblem of speed and the technological transformations of time in the 19th century. It's also very important that the whole coordination of time, the reason why we have clocks coordinated is because trains had to get you somewhere on time, and they had to pick you up at a certain time. Stops at a station, you had to know what time that time was. And actually, at this moment, there was still a kind of bilingual system of time where a railroad station would have local time. Noon is the sun, but our railroads have to travel on a coordinated time, so they would actually have two clocks, one that showed what time it was where you were, and one that showed a kind of universal time. So the railroad's in the background showing that kind of time, and these guys are at some kind of bar outside of Paris, and they were called déclassés. This is Raffaele's term for them. And what this means, déclassés were kind of fallen bourgeois, fallen middle-class people. They once had a family, they once had a job. They lost it all, a stock market crash, or they became alcoholics, and they lost it all. And then they just become, downtrodden, poor people living out in the middle of nowhere. The déclassés also implied a certain kind of criminality. They're at the edges of order. They were living outside the law, maybe ex-revolutionaries. And it's worth noting that this painting was painted exactly 10 years after the revolutionary Paris Commune of 1871. So politics is a key component of all of this temporality. And I argue that this painting is a kind of intentionally resistant painting, a painting that resists the ordering and disciplining of time in modern life. Also in 1881, but in a somewhat different key, the young Belgian painter James Ensor painted a scene in his family drawing room. He shows a woman playing the piano, and it's actually a sister posing there, while a gentleman caller sits quietly and listens in a standard middle-class interior. So like Raffaele, it is a picture of idleness and a certain resistance to work. These are people not doing anything, or not doing work, certainly not anything they're paid to do. If only a kind of bourgeois reflection of the undisciplined time of the marginal poor. And I suggest there is this kind of parallelism between the people who are free are those that have lots of money, and people who have no money at all. And everybody else, most of all of us, have some kind of increasingly disciplined sense of time. We have to be somewhere. We have to stay somewhere. Someone pays us for our time. And these are painters on sort of opposite edges of the social spectrum, sort of proposing alternatives to this. Unlike his French peers, however, Ensor seems here to hold in tension more sharply the unmoving, continuous motif, a guy just sitting there listening to music, with a paint handling that is suggestive of the flickering and transient visual sensation. The whole bottom third of this painting is just little flicks of paint suggesting just the instantaneous and passing moment. A work like this is somewhat exceptional in the constellation of later realist painting, but it also indicates one trajectory out of later realism. These tensions and contradictions of the two orders of temporality gave way in Ensor's case to a decades-long experimentation in radical pictorial innovation. He's one of the most innovative artists of the late 19th century, and I argue in the book this is precisely because he was so interested in late realism and Impressionism's alternative to that. So these are the paintings that I talk about in my book. Each of the five chapters is devoted to one of these works. And in their depiction of durational temporality, they all exemplify the generational concern with time and the politics of time. And they also demonstrate, as my title suggests, the persistence of realism in the age of Impressionism. Thank you all.
Our next speaker is Mary Torres Creede, who's instructor in art here at Stern College for Women. She's a native New Yorker, a teaching artist, fine artist, and professional commercial artist with 30 years experience in creative problem-solving across many disciplines. She's a graduate of the University of Virginia's Fine Art and Theater programs and has been an instructor at Stern since 2009. She's also co-owner and art director of Gerard's studio, where she designs, builds, and paints for the Broadway stage, and creates her own artworks, primarily paintings, some of which we'll see, of course, as well as commissioned works. One of these, a back-painted glass mural of the Milky Way, is currently installed in the main entrance at the Children's Hospital at Montefiore. She continues to collaborate with other artists and child life specialists at Memorial Sloan Kettering to create permanent installations of patient artworks, one of her most rewarding endeavors. Please help me welcome Mary Creede.
The collection of all the images of all the different kinds of things we're involved with, and I say we because I really do collaborate with a lot of other artists, are evidence on my website, so I haven't prepared anything formal separate from this. I'm just going to highlight a few things. And I've been thinking a lot lately about the 30 years of collaboration and partnership with my partner, who is also my partner in crime and my partner in life. And recently we had a show in Virginia, a friend of mine from UVA, and also a co-op gallery I was involved in Richmond, Virginia, owns a gallery there. He teaches at Sweetbriar, and he invited us to have a show. And when we were, and this is literally the first time I ever had a show exclusively with my partner. And we thought about this as, in a way, I thought about the show because our work is somewhat divergent, but really when we started putting it together in a space outside of our studio, you could see the way things have become intertwined so much. Not so much literally, but you could see the cohesion in our partnership in this show. So we titled the show Live, Work. And this idea being now that they're getting on, but not getting on, experientially, artist-wise, I thought of a quote from Brock, who said, "With age, art and life become one." So reflecting on all of that and thinking more and more about even this commercial work and how it informs everything we do. So even though we're solving all these problems for Broadway, and I hope you're not getting dizzy at this point, a lot of it is also the best preparation you can have to make something that is your own problem to solve. So when I go to make a painting, I might hesitate to see what the direction is I'm going in, or see what kind of thorough attentiveness I want to bring to whatever the subject or observation I'm going to have. But in terms of technique, I'm more or less saying, well, which one am I going to use? And which one is too much like this? And which one is me? And what am I searching for, trying to carry out here? These pieces, so initially in this scroll through at the beginning, these are mostly the commercial Broadway pieces. And this one being from the Book of Mormon, sculpting. There are pieces that people have to dance in, obviously. There are puppets and things that have to perform by themselves on stage. This in particular, this was the mural that was mentioned at the beginning. And this piece is a stop-motion animation we're also working on in the studio. This project was a 15-foot-tall puppet for Cinderella, more costumes. But in terms of my work in our studio, well, I'll introduce and then I'll look over some things. This would be the section of my personal paintings. So most of the time, over the most recent, these are a little bit older now, I became preoccupied with the presence of different kinds of artificial light. And my studio is in Red Hook, so it's down by the container port. So really looking across, especially in the rain, and seeing all these gigantic objects kind of lit with all these different artificial light sources, and the colors and the way they transformed these really basic shapes in a lot of ways. I definitely think there's a theatrical element at work here, just being so accustomed to all the backdrops I painted and this kind of transcendent space that you get when you're looking at scenery. So these were the kinds of subjects I was exploring probably through a smattering of the last 10 years. And now I'm working on some different kinds of things. Because in my drawing notebooks, I seem to be significantly drawn to different kinds of textures, again with light, but also piles, knots. I'm constantly photographing the I'm going to call it detritus of our work in the shop, if it's a pile of wood shavings, or in fact, if we're chasing, we do all these candles that we cast for Hamilton, and once you drill all those out, all the shavings that come from those, so I keep like arranging these piles and photographing them and drawing the lights and darks in there and really focusing on the textures. And oddly enough, it's in working and through working that I kind of figure out the back end of it, what might be the content. So the artworks have form and content, right? It's the form they take and the content is what you're trying to say. I have always worked pretty much with an observational source, okay? So while I see my voice really coming through, I see what's attracting me. I can see the element of the stage. I can see that the different light sources and the traffic, which still attracts me, is present. But then you wonder through working, how am I transitioning? What's happening here? Why am I attracted to piles? Why am I attracted to knots or kind of crazy assemblages of things? I started drawing not too long ago these hands. And I came across these in a photo essay that I had seen in the New York Times. It was in there maybe 3 years ago now. And this photographer photographed as portraits, his name was Christopher Griffith, shoe shiner hands. Do you remember that? Wasn't it spectacular? And I started to draw these in my book that I do the daily drawing in. And then my partner said, those are pretty significant. You should get those out of there. And I was like, I'm just drawing, maybe I'll make something. And ultimately, the friend that owns the gallery that gave us the show in Virginia came to the studio last year and said, what are you doing? You should be on better paper. Right. So there you go. But I put them on better paper, and they are significantly larger than they were. But then I started to really, in terms of focusing on this drawing, kind of intense drawing of these hands, I really wanted to incorporate some of those textures into these watercolor landscapes that I was doing, fairly large also, that were involved in, again, crinkles, like dunes and little rock formations, and really almost microscopically being drawn to those. And I think, again, it's still like the contrast of the light and the color that draws me in. But then I started to take some of the kinds of shapes that I was drawing in the hands and those textures and incorporating them into the landscapes. These, I would say, were fairly recent. I did these, I was working on those in the fall through February. But they were also kind of a follow-up to this piece. And I should make these bigger, right? What am I doing? I'm like just scrolling back and forth. All right, so these pieces. So back underneath there is one of those nighttime urban landscapes that, I don't know. After a while, the more I did them, the less complete they seemed. And then I started thinking about integrating them with some other kinds of images that I was focusing on in terms of my tangles and piles of things. So this, I would say these three, if they were going to be, I was going to talk about kind of a breakthrough in the discipline or I don't want to say radical change, but something that I saw myself firmly going in another direction. That would happen with these three paintings, I think. And I did I did those a couple of years ago, or probably beginning of last year. And then that kind of cemented this idea of the piles, but also now layering. And it's funny to talk about time, because in the sense of revisiting these older works, and now I don't really have older works to revisit, so I'm painting one work on top of another work. I'm wondering at one point it's going to be simultaneous, but really kind of completing one and then revisiting it with another image and seeing how that actually transforms it spatially. And I think it's in a temporal way, really. In terms of this preoccupation with the piles, come back, go back. Like this piece. Come on. All right. This piece, okay, again was a layering of one painting on top of another, but it's mostly even become now 3 or 4 paintings on top of another as I kind of work back into it. And I named this painting Rabbit Hole because it was this sense of, what am I doing? Am I going down the rabbit hole? And I remember speaking to one of the women that works with me in my studio, and I said, I think I have so much going on sometimes that I'm afraid that I won't be able to focus again. But in a way, I think that through these works, I'm embracing all the kind of tangled mess of our present lives and the way society is now, that even if you purge your apartment of everything that you don't love, you're still going to wake up to an inbox that's completely stuffed with spam, right? So that is this the idea that I embrace this, that I embrace the multitasking, investigate how this simultaneity is translating into a visual image. And it might be, a rationalization, but in terms of provoking food for thought through my painting, it's like, maybe that's what I'm kind of visually investigating here. Okay. And this would be, we flip through these. And this is the show that just closed, and this would be probably, this one is one of the more recent ones. I just completed this painting like a couple of weeks ago. And investigating that once again, in this idea that you have this incredible stillness in the image, so it's frozen and we can regard this person forever, right? But also that within the be here now sensibility, is it all about the focus of one thing, or the fact that you can never really just be experiencing one thing, right? You always have a taste in your mouth. There's always a noise, right? This cacophony that we have in New York City, right? And constantly preoccupied, right? So what does that say about, well, what does that say? We know what it says. Experientially, there's clutter, right? So maybe that's what's going on. I based this painting, I think, on a day I went to Bryant Park with the watercolor class. All right. So going back to our more commercial stuff. So we do props, sets, backdrops, scenic painting, problem solving for Broadway shows, puppets, and sculptural costuming. This one was especially fun, this one, because this number, come on, So this is some of the in-process work. This is Ashley Stevens, probably the best craftsperson in New York. But what I loved about this project is it was Radio City Music Hall production, the Spring Spectacular. The number is called Rock the Met. So went to the Oceana section of like one of my favorite sections of the Met and did the research. Of course, when I looked at them, I was like, wow, these are teeny, but I was significantly larger. But we had the opportunity to duplicate some of those ceremonial costumes that were there. And this is some of the process. If you go, you can click through and see process photos on all of these. But the other thing we got to do with that project is recreate the armor. All right, so this was a particular problem because recreate the armor and then all the guys have to do splits in the armor. So this is all flat pattern, the way you would flat pattern a garment, out of foam. It's called EVA foam. It is closed cell foam. It's the kind of thing that's on the soles of your shoes, on your athletic shoes, your sneakers. So you flat pattern it, glue it together. Making this stuff, it has to work for 8 to 10 shows a week, 52 weeks a year, so it has to all be super, super sturdy, because if it can be trashed, it will be trashed. But I loved this project. You could get really, even just the research was so great, and creating all the textures. This is some of the work that we do with the pediatric cancer patients at Memorial Sloan Kettering. I thoroughly enjoy this. You know, there's just, you get completely lost in the fact that you just have this incredible one-on-one with some pretty courageous kids that are really getting to, they do crafts all the time. The childlike people up there are incredible, and I have a lot of respect for art therapists and the people that run those programs and really spread a tremendous amount of love every day. But the funny thing about this project, and when they contacted us to do it, they said, the thing about this for you is that you actually have to create something specific that's going to be installed. So in this weird way, you're kind of project managing these pediatric cancer patients, but we did find a way to do it. And actually this idea that you would be, now we have it pretty well set up that the next group is seeing what the last group did. So they have 3 18-foot long bays. We've even done some of them where the Yankees give them a tremendous amount of money. So we did one that was all baseball and actually put in a motor so some of the baseball players that the kids made were running the bases. And but it also gives the people that are in the waiting room with their kids for like hours and hours and hours at a time, things to look at, talk about, point to. So we get them all to draw. I usually set up a theme and do like a rough sketch that's the entire length, outlined in charcoal so they can get a sense of what we're aiming for. And you really kind of get them all organized to do this project. And because it's becoming this larger thing, it's not necessarily the same kind of craft thing they do every day. Right. So there's a really specific goal, and it's really incredible once you have a goal how people pull together. And even they pull together, as sick as they are. They'll come back from a procedure and be like, okay, I got to finish my thing. And some of the patients that do improve come and work with us at the studio when we're finally assembling the whole thing. And that can be really great too. A lesson I learned from Nina Pickett, who is the woman that's head of pediatrics at Memorial Sloan Kettering. She taught me something important. This was a commission that we did for them. Oh, please stop. We do back painted glass. I'll move on to the other back painted glass mural at Montefiore. And that's essentially who we did the Montefiore job through Rockwell. And I'll explain more about that in a minute. But we did the back painted glass, and we do a lot of back painted glass public art commissions. We did one for the aquarium, and it's reverse painting in aigle-mise, which is essentially gold leafing the back glass. But you have to work completely in reverse. So you want to talk about different kinds of textures. It's layering up thin layers of paint. And you have to make it complex enough, and layer after layer after layer. But the thing is that you can't really see it that well. But that's where I really use my color aid paper, which is matte colored sheets. Shove that underneath to keep matching the color. But you start with your last layer first. So you have to kind of work backwards and predict, what that's going to be. But when we had the meeting about this project, I was looking a lot at Egon Schiele landscapes, right, which have a special quality, I think. And I was saying, boy, I never have really tried to abstract a landscape like that and paint that on glass. And Nina Pickett said to me, that's really nice, but we can't have anything that people implant on. So she said it has to be not too crazy cheerful, but she said there are people that leave here and hate orange juice for the rest of their life because they correlate it with the experience of being a cancer patient. So she said I need something up, but not too up, pleasant, but not boring, something that's engaging, but something that won't implant on somebody. And I go, oh, wow, that is smart. Right. So, looking at some Kandinskis. And this is ultimately, and this was in a waiting area that was also used as a consulting room. This is more of our art glass, back painted glass piece. This is the piece for the Coney Island Aquarium. So this was a montage, and again, a little bit more representational, obviously, than that. But this was also for a public area where there were going to be a lot of kids. I'm trying to get to my first page. And this is the mural at Montefiore. And here are some of the process pieces. So this one was particularly challenging because they didn't necessarily want a gigantic Duratrans of the gallery. So when they built the hospital in Montefiore, they had a huge bequest from Carl Sagan's estate. So the idea of each floor in this hospital, in the children's hospital, was developed through Rockwell with a different kind of a theme, right? And the idea of you are part of the universe. Right? So initially, we were given the commission for this back painted glass mural, and I do think that this preceded the one at the aquarium, but we had always basically done patterns like the other ones I just flashed through. And the architects at Rockwell came by with one of the samples I had dropped off there, and they said, we're doing this big galaxy mural, and we think it would look best like this. It's very, very rich and deep. It really does look very different from just laying a big coat of varnish on something. It's very resonant. But It's a back pane of glass. It's like, okay, that's great, like something representational. The glass pieces are 12 foot tall and 3 feet wide. It's about 28 feet long, and it had to be accurate. So there was actually an artist from National Geographic who came out to check my star map accuracy. So you think about it, you're having an accurate star map, and you're painting it in reverse, right? So you're working from underneath first. So here's some different stages. And then I realized, and we had to build these gigantic collars to flip the glass, because even if it's a half-inch thick, over 12 feet, if you pick up a piece of glass like that, it's just a big potato chip. So there was that. And then I realized that when we flipped them all over, they were out of order. So not only did we have to flip them over, we had to walk them down 30 feet to the other end to set them up. So we didn't flip the whole thing over very often. And I just didn't answer a phone call that whole summer. Okay, so I'm sure everybody's had enough. And thank you for indulging me.